Hi guys, Dr. Rob Barrington here with some more nutrition advice. I was doing some research in the week and I stumbled across quite an interesting study that I thought was worth sharing with my subscribers. It was a study that it adds to the information that I've already given on saturated fat and cardiovascular disease. Those of you who have watched many of my videos will understand that I don't subscribe to the theory that saturated fat is a cause of cardiovascular disease, and I don't subscribe to the theory that cholesterol in the diet is also implicated as a causative factor in cardiovascular disease. I think the science surrounding this, a lot of it is propaganda, and I think it's very important to go over this information because the mainstream information that you get about saturated fat and about cholesterol is still really it's outdated, and it's still reporting that saturated fat and cholesterol are involved as causative factors in cardiovascular disease, and really the science doesn't support that viewpoint at all. So I will put the link to this study in the description below this video, so that you can have a look at the study yourself. Really, it was a study that looked at the effects of 3 different diets on postmenopausal women. The 3 diets were a high cheese diet, a high meat diet, which contained a mixture of processed and unprocessed meat that was high in saturated fat, and the control diet was actually a high carbohydrate diet. And this diet included white bread, it included refined pasta, and there was also fruits and vegetables in that diet as well. So the control diet was really what the researchers considered to be a normal diet. What that actually means, it's open to interpretation, but I think it was a reasonable representation of what you may consider the typical Westerner to consume. Now, the interesting thing about this study was that the authors separated dairy from meat, which is not often what you see in studies. Quite often these 2 food groups are grouped together as saturated fat, but they designed this study so that the women consumed these diets for 2 weeks each. So they consumed the cheese diet or the meat diet or the carbohydrate diet for 2 weeks in a random order. They would then have a 2-week period where they didn't consume that diet, and then they would consume one of the diets they hadn't already consumed. So at the end of the study, all of the women had consumed all 3 of the diets. Now, what the study authors found when they looked at the results was that the cheese diet actually caused an increase in high density lipoprotein cholesterol in the blood, and they also found, not surprisingly, that the ApoA1 protein particle had also increased, and the increase was about 5 to 8% for these 2 components. Now, the ApoA1 particle is part of the high density lipoprotein cholesterol lipoprotein, and therefore it's not surprising that if HDL goes up, you see an increase in the ApoA1 protein. So both these components went up. That indicated that high density lipoprotein cholesterol had increased. Now, high density lipoprotein cholesterol, an increase in the plasma in the blood, is associated with a protective effect against cardiovascular disease. So consumption of the cheese diet actually increased high density lipoprotein cholesterol, and there's many substances that have been investigated that have been found to increase high density lipoprotein cholesterol, and it's generally considered to have a protective effect against the development of cardiovascular disease. It's not cause and effect, there's an association there, but the metabolic changes that cause increases in HDL are also likely protective of cardiovascular disease. What they also found with the cheese diet was that there was an increase in, a decrease in the ApoB particle, and the ApoB particle is associated with the LDL lipoprotein, and a decrease in LDL cholesterol in the blood is also associated with a protective effect against cardiovascular disease. So the ApoB to ApoA1 ratio decreased. In other words, the LDL to HDL ratio decreased, and that means there was a protective effect against cardiovascular disease for consuming a high cheese diet. And it was quite a considerable amount of cheese. It was something like 90 to 120 grams of cheese a day. So this is not supportive of the fact that of the theory that high saturated dairy diets are a cause of cardiovascular disease, because these subjects actually had improvements in their blood parameters that would show that they were actually at reduced risk of developing cardiovascular disease. So I've always said that cheese in moderation is fine as long as you're not allergic to dairy, as long as you're not intolerant to dairy. There's nothing wrong with eating cheese, and in this study quite a lot of cheese is still actually okay. Similar results were found for the meat diet. There was about a 5 to 8% increase in HDL, and so the meat diet as well was shown to be protective of cardiovascular disease. And this was despite the fact that the meats that were chosen were high fat meats, and they were both processed and unprocessed, but they were still high saturated fat meats. They didn't use lean meat. The lean meat was kept for the high carbohydrate diet. They consumed lean meats, but those consuming high fatty meats actually had improvements in their their blood chemistry that would indicate that they had a reduced risk of cardiovascular disease. Now, this study shouldn't be taken in isolation. You shouldn't really take any study in isolation, but this is just one of many studies that when you add them together, the evidence that saturated fat, whether it comes from dairy or from meat, is a cause of cardiovascular disease. The evidence is just not there. More often than not, where you find the evidence for cardiovascular disease in terms of food groupings is with carbohydrate, and in particular the refined carbohydrate. And now the reason these diets may actually have been protective when compared to the carbohydrate diet is that the carbohydrate diet contained white bread, which would be refined, and it also contained pasta, which would have been refined. So the diet that most people, if you quizzed them on the street, most people would probably say is the one that would be protective of cardiovascular disease, is the one that actually gave the blood chemistry changes that would put the subjects at higher risk of cardiovascular disease. If you widen this, and we look at a wider scope of this information, this is often, if you look at people that consume the Atkins diet, which is really a high meat, high protein, high saturated fat diet, he does advocate the use of cheese, and people do eat cheese on that diet. Quite often when you investigate people that take this, that follow this diet, anecdotally they lose weight. Studies that have looked at people that follow the Atkins diet show that they lose weight, and studies have also measured their cardiovascular parameters in their blood, show that they actually have improvements in their cardiovascular parameters, which is exactly what Atkins said in his book. Increases in HDL, decreases in LDL, improvements in the LDL to HDL ratio, and decreases in total cholesterol. So the Atkins diet, this high fat, high cheese, high meat, high saturated fat, high cholesterol diet, which many people consider to be, a diet that would cause cardiovascular disease, it's actually the opposite. The diet that most, mainstream sites would advocate as a cardioprotective diet, which would be a high carbohydrate, low saturated fat, low cholesterol diet, the evidence is mounting that is actually the diet that is most likely to induce cardiovascular disease. So you've got to be very careful when you look for nutritional information. You've got to go to the studies, and you've got to analyze them, and you've got to look at what the data actually says. Even the interpretation of some of the studies you have to take with a pinch of salt. It's the data that's important, and you have to make your own conclusions from that data. And this is why I put together my blog and these videos. I know they're quite technical, but what I'm trying to get people to do, and I'm trying to encourage people to do, is to become their own nutritionists. If you rely on the word of another man, that man can quite easily lie to you. You have to become your own nutritionist and your own scientist. You have to go and find the information yourself. You don't want to take the information from a second party or a third party or fourth party. You want to go directly to the data, and you want to have a look at the information yourself, because quite often it's very easy to spin that data into an interpretation that is not representative of the original data. And I think this is really where where the science of saturated fat and cholesterol has broken down. The data is quite clear. If you go and look at the data, it's quite clear that there is no link between dietary cholesterol, dietary saturated fat, and cardiovascular disease. But somewhere between the data, the original data, and the information the public gets, the information has been spun, twisted, and therefore the picture you get is a distorted picture that leaves people often confused and saying they don't understand nutrition because everybody says something different. The data doesn't lie. The data says the same thing consistently, and if you can go to that data, if you can teach yourself to understand that data, you can bypass all of that disinformation. And if you go to my blog, there is a section on statistics, on how to understand statistics in studies. It explains the different types of statistics that are used so that you can analyze some of the data. And I would encourage you to start reading the actual papers, even if it's just the abstract, and picking out some of the data so you get your eye in and you get a feel for how this data it can be interpreted. You don't have to be a trained scientist to understand it. You just have to take your time, work your way through it. And the information is there, and it gives you a gold mine of information in order to be able to improve your life and improve your health without having to rely on the word of snake oil salesmen who sell you their particular spin on their interpretation of what they think that is often not actually correct, but what they want you to think is correct. So have a look at this paper, try and delve into these papers that I put the links up for. It is worthwhile in the long term to be able to teach yourself to be your own nutritionist. Another thing that was interesting in this paper that has been shown in previous studies was that the cheese actually caused an increase in fecal fat excretion, and it did this through an increase in the taurine conjugated bile acids. It's been hypothesized that one of the effects of dairy is that dairy can actually increase fecal fat excretion. It's been hypothesized, for example, that the calcium may bind with fat also and cause calcium soaps to form, which then increases fat excretion. And this may be one of the ways that dairy actually causes weight loss. There is an association between consuming dairy and having a lower body weight. And this study supported that the cheese actually increased taurine conjugated bile acid excretion, which was different to the meat and the carbohydrate diets. So that was quite interesting as well, and the authors, to their credit, did pick that out, and that's something that does support previous studies. So there is this, there are effects of dairy, there are effects of meat we don't really understand. Although many studies are published, we're still really only scratching the surface with a lot of the information on nutrition, which is why a mixture of anecdotal and scientific information is probably the best way to go. Relying just on the science, it often leaves you too far behind in terms of what's actually the real picture. You have to use your own experience and mix it with the science, because this, the science is still very limited. Even though obviously nutritional research has been at full tilt for best part of 50 years now. Really, certain subjects there is very little research into, and therefore we don't really understand the full picture. Some there is an association between dairy and body weight, but really no one understands what that association is or how it works, and therefore it's very difficult to actually give recommendations. So have a read of this paper. It is quite an interesting one, and it does dispel some of the myths, not all of them, but it's more evidence to add to the arsenal of information that shows that saturated fat and cholesterol in the diet can actually be you can actually produce a healthy diet by eating a high cholesterol, high saturated fat diet. The Maasai, of course, of the tribes of Maasai in Africa, they consume high amounts of saturated fat and high amounts of dairy. In fact, that's virtually all they eat. And if they consume their traditional diets and they live in their traditional way, they don't have any evidence of cardiovascular disease at all. So this is another piece of evidence to add to that, to show that really saturated fat and cholesterol have been misrepresented in the mainstream. So I hope that was interesting. If you want to have a look at the paper, please do, and I'll see you soon for another video. And in the meantime, eat well, stay healthy, and protect yourself, and I'll see you soon.